The autopsy of the paper dragon begins not with a bang, but with the quiet, crushing realization that China has already lost the war against nature itself. A defeat that no amount of hypersonic missiles or wolf warrior diplomacy can reverse because biology does not care about propaganda and math cannot be bribed. To understand why China is functionally incapable of sustaining a conflict with India, we must first dissect the demographic collapse that is currently hollowing out the nation from the inside, a phenomenon rooted in the hard science of population dynamics which dictates that once a civilization crosses a certain threshold of decline, it enters a death spiral that is mathematically impossible to escape. This brings us to the concept of replacement level fertility, a term that sounds dry but is actually the most terrifying phrase in the Chinese language right now, originally defined by early demographers and population biologists who calculated that for a species or a nation to simply maintain its numbers without growing or shrinking, the average woman must produce exactly 2.1 children. This is not an arbitrary number pulled out of thin air by Western analysts to annoy Beijing. It is a biological constant where the 2 replaces the mother and the father, and the zero point 0.1 accounts for children who tragically do not survive to reproductive age or choose not to have children themselves. When a country drops below this magic number of 2.1, it doesn't just stop growing, it begins to age and shrink, and China has not just dropped below this number, they have plummeted off a cliff into the abyss of roughly 1.0 or even lower in major urban centers, meaning each generation is half the size of the one before it, a collapse so severe that it makes the population decline of medieval Europe look like a minor stumble. This demographic suicide was engineered by the Chinese Communist Party itself through the one child policy, a decision that will go down in history as the single greatest act of self sabotage ever committed by a government against its own people, effectively creating a 4-2-1 social structure that is the ultimate strategic vulnerability in any war scenario. This structure means that for every single working age adult, let's call him the little emperor soldier, there are 2 aging parents and 4 increasingly frail grandparents who are entirely dependent on him for their survival, financial support, and care because the state pension system is practically non existent and the social safety net is a myth. In a normal society like India, the population pyramid is wide at the bottom with plenty of young people to support the few elderly at the top, creating a robust engine of consumption and manpower. But China has inverted this pyramid so it balances precariously on a tiny base of stressed out, overworked only children. If you take that one young man, that little emperor who is the sole genetic and financial lifeline for 6 other people, and you throw him into a high altitude meat grinder in the Himalayas to fight Indian troops, you aren't just deploying a soldier, you are risking the extinction of an entire family line and the starvation of the 6 elderly people he supports. The casualty aversion this creates is paralyzing for the Chinese leadership because they know that every death notice sent home isn't just a tragedy, it is a catalyst for social unrest among a population that has sacrificed everything for the state and received nothing but an empty promise of glory in return. This biological imperative directly collides with the economic reality of the dark factories, a dystopian concept that the technocrats in Beijing hail as the future but is actually a tombstone for their economy. These are vast manufacturing hubs where robots and automated systems build products in total darkness because machines do not need light to see, do not need bathroom breaks, do not form unions, and do not ask for human rights. While this sounds efficient on paper to a dictator who views humans as messy biological units, it ignores the fundamental law of economics which states that production is useless without consumption, or in simpler terms, robots do not buy shoes. An economy thrives on the velocity of money, on the cycle where a worker earns a wage and spends it on goods and services, driving demand for more production. But when you replace the worker with a robot in a dark factory, you sever this cycle completely because the robot earns zero wages and consumes zero products. It does not buy a house, it does not go to the movies, it does not pay taxes, and it certainly does not buy the consumer goods that keep the economy spinning. This brings us to the stark contrast with India, a consumer driven powerhouse where an Indian father with 5 children is an economic engine all by himself because he buys 5 pairs of shoes, 5 school bags, 5 mobile phones, and 5 motorcycles, creating a massive internal market that insulates India from global shocks. In China, the replacement of the human worker with the dark machine has created a supply side monster that produces billions of widgets that its own shrinking, aging, and unemployed population cannot afford to buy. This forces China to rely desperately on exports to beg the world to buy the junk its robots are making in the dark, but the world has moved on. After the global pandemic and the geopolitical bullying of the last decade, major economies like the United States, Europe, and even developing nations have realized that relying on a totalitarian state for essential goods is a strategic suicide pact. The world is decoupling, with factories moving to Vietnam, Mexico, and most importantly, India under the Make in India initiative, which is capitalizing on the very demographic dividend that China squandered. China was a $4 trillion economy in 2008, roughly where India stands today, and it grew by being the factory of the world. But that era is dead because you cannot force people to buy your exports when they actively despise your government and fear your spy balloons. The Chinese economy is now like a shark that must keep swimming, exporting to breathe. But the ocean has dried up, leaving it thrashing in the sand while the Indian tiger watches from the jungle, fueled by its own internal ecosystem of consumption and growth. Compounding this disaster is the Aladdin nature of Chinese data, a reference to the dictator who changes words to mean whatever he wants. Because in China, statistics are not a reflection of reality but a tool of political survival. Local officials, terrified of being purged for missing growth targets, have for decades fabricated birth rates and population numbers, leading independent demographers to estimate that the official population count of 1.4 billion is overinflated by at least 100 million people. That is an entire Japan or Egypt that simply does not exist. These are ghost people who appear on spreadsheets to secure funding and make the leadership feel powerful, but who will never pay a yuan in taxes or hold a rifle on the border. When the dictator asks for the population data, the terrified bureaucrat gives him the Aladdin number, the one that keeps his head on his shoulders, but you cannot fight a war with ghost soldiers, and you cannot build an economy on fake consumers. This culture of lies has created a fragility in the system, effectively blinding themselves to the severity of their own decline. Furthermore, the law of nature regarding migration seals their fate as a declining power because, unlike the United States, Canada, or Europe, which replenish their aging populations with millions of eager, ambitious immigrants from the developing world, China is a closed fortress. The West is aspirational. People dream of the American dream, of freedom, of a life where they can speak their minds and build a future, which acts as a demographic fountain of youth. But nobody, absolutely nobody, dreams of migrating to China to live in a surveillance state where their movements are tracked by facial recognition cameras, their internet is censored, and their ability to book a train ticket depends on a social credit score that functions like a digital leash. This means China has zero inflow of fresh human capital to offset its collapsing birth rate, turning it into a biological cul-de-sac where the gene pool is shrinking and the society is aging into irrelevance. The night map of the Earth taken from satellites reveals this vulnerability in stark, glowing detail, showing that while India's population is spread across the subcontinent in a vibrant, chaotic, and resilient distribution that covers mountains, plains, and coasts, China's population is dangerously clustered in the eastern coastal plains, huddled together in the light, while the vast western interior remains dark and empty. This concentration makes them a sitting duck for strategic encirclement and reveals that their strategic depth is largely uninhabited wasteland, whereas India inhabits its geography fully and robustly. The combination of these factors, the irreversible science of replacement fertility, the dystopian failure of the dark factories, the lie of the population numbers, and the closed nature of their society, means that China is fighting a war against entropy that it has already lost. They are a nation of elderly dependents supported by a shrinking class of only children armed with robots that cannot consume and led by a government that is terrified of its own shadow. To launch a war against India in this state would be to accelerate their own collapse, to shatter the fragile glass house they have built, because the moment the first little emperor dies and the supply of goods stops flowing through the Strait of Malacca, the entire illusion of Chinese power evaporates, leaving behind nothing but a rapidly aging population wondering where their future went. They are not a dragon breathing fire. They are a museum exhibit of a superpower that never was, crumbling under the weight of its own hubris and the undeniable brutal laws of nature. If the demographic collapse is the chronic disease killing the Chinese superpower dream, geography is the brick wall they are about to drive into at 100 miles per hour. You cannot hack a mountain. You cannot bribe a glacier. And you certainly cannot propaganda your way out of the fact that the laws of physics are fundamentally stacked against a ground invasion from the north. To understand why a war in the Himalayas is a suicide mission for the People's Liberation Army PLA, we have to look beyond the shiny videos of tanks and look at the brutal reality of the map, specifically the map at night. There is a satellite image of the Earth taken at night that tells you everything you need to know about the strategic vulnerability of China, a secret that Beijing tries desperately to hide under layers of development rhetoric. When you look at India at night, the lights are everywhere. From the Himalayas in the north to the coastal tips of the south, from the deserts of Gujarat to the jungles of the northeast, the country is a galaxy of scattered light. This reveals a crucial strategic fact. India's population and infrastructure are distributed. It is a resilient mesh. You can bomb a city and the grid survives. The population is accustomed to every terrain mountains, jungles, deserts, plains. Now look at China on that same night map. It is shocking. The lights are not a galaxy, they are a thin glowing scar running down the eastern coast. Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, that is where 90% of the population, the economy, and the little emperors live. The rest of the country, the vast western interior, Tibet, Xinjiang, is pitch black. It is an empty void. This reveals two fatal weaknesses. First, China lacks strategic depth in terms of human habitation. Their entire center of gravity is clustered in a few coastal targets that are easily reachable by missiles. Second, and more importantly for a war with India, the Chinese population are flatlanders. They are genetically and culturally adapted to the pressurized, oxygen rich environment of the sea level plains. They are not mountain people. This brings us to the oxygen deficit, which is where the biology of the little emperor meets the brutality of the roof of the world. The Sino Indian border isn't a line on a map, it is an atmospheric kill zone ranging from 14,000 to 18,000 feet. At these heights, the air pressure drops so low that the effective oxygen available to the human body is cut in half. For a soldier recruited from the sea level concrete jungles of Shanghai, this isn't just uncomfortable, it is medically catastrophic. When you pluck a young man who has spent his entire life in an air conditioned mall at zero elevation and drop him into the Galwan Valley, his body goes into shock. His heart rate spikes to 140 beats per minute just standing still. His blood thickens as his body desperately tries to produce more red blood cells, turning his circulatory system into sludge. He suffers from high altitude cerebral edema, HICE. Essentially, his brain swells inside his skull because of the pressure difference. The Chinese military knows this. They are terrified of it, and their solution is the ultimate proof of their weakness luxury oxygen. The PLA has built elaborate heated barracks with pumped in oxygen on their side of the border. They have issued portable oxygen concentrators to their troops. State media parades this as technological superiority and caring for the troops. It is a lie. It is a fatal admission that their soldiers are biologically unfit for the terrain. A soldier who needs a machine to breathe is not a soldier, he is a patient. In a real war, the first thing that happens is the logistics chain breaks. An Indian artillery shell hits the generator powering the oxygen tanks. A drone strike takes out the supply truck carrying the oxygen canisters. What happens then? That Chinese soldier, whose lungs have been artificially coddled in a pressurized tent, is suddenly forced to run 500 meters uphill with a 30 kg pack to dodge mortar fire. He won't make it 10 steps. He will collapse, gasping for air like a fish on a deck, not because he's a coward, but because physics denied him the fuel to move his muscles. Contrast this with the Indian army. India doesn't need oxygen tents because India has the mountain people. The Indian army recruits heavily from the Himalayan regions the Dogras, the Garhwalis, the Kumaonis, the Ladakh Scouts, and the Tibetan border police. These are men whose families have lived at high altitudes for thousands of years. Evolution has done the engineering for them. Their lungs are larger, their chest cavities are broader, and their blood is chemically efficient at scrubbing oxygen from thin air. Even the Indian troops from the plains undergo a legendary acclimatization process that is brutal, slow, and completely devoid of luxury. They force the body to adapt. By the time an Indian soldier is deployed to a forward post, he is a biological machine tuned to the environment. When the Chinese and Indian troops clashed in the Galwan Valley in 2020, fighting hand to hand with stones and clubs, the result was a foregone conclusion. The Chinese troops were gasping, disoriented, and physically weaker while the Indians were fighting in their backyard. And let's talk about the equipment because this is where the dark factory mindset fails again. China builds weapons for parades, not for mountains. Their tanks are heavy, designed for the flat plains of the coast or the tank friendly terrain of Russia. In the Himalayas, a heavy tank is a liability. The engines, starved of oxygen, lose 40% of their power. They wheeze and stall on steep gradients. The roads on the Chinese side are paved and pretty, yes, but roads are static targets. Once the shooting starts, the bridges get dropped and the tunnels collapse. Then what? You need off road capability. You need animals. The Indian Army maintains one of the largest and most sophisticated animal transport networks in the world. thousands of mules and yaks that can navigate goat paths no tank could ever dream of. While Chinese conscripts are waiting for a truck to bring them MREs, meals ready to eat that taste like the gutter oil. Yes, gutter oil, the same oil the Chinese low ranking soldiers is habituated and nostalgic to. What you don't know about Chinese gutter oil? Indian supplies are being walked up the ridge line by mules that don't need spare parts. India fights with a low tech, high endurance philosophy that outlasts the fragile, high tech fragility of the PLA. Then there is the issue of the one child soldier psychology in this terrain. We established that the little emperor is the sole support for his family. Now put him in a trench at minus 40 degrees Celsius. He is cold, he is hypoxic, he is miserable, and he has a smartphone. The PLA struggles immensely with morale because these young men, addicted to the digital dopamine of the coastal cities, psychologically shatter in the isolation of the mountains. The Indian soldier, often coming from rural, rugged backgrounds, treats the hardship as a badge of honor. The Paltan regiment is his family. He fights for the honor of his unit. The Chinese soldier fights because the algorithm told him to, and that motivation evaporates the moment the Wi Fi cuts out. But the geographical nightmare for China doesn't end in the mountains, it extends to the oceans, where the Malacca dilemma acts as a noose around their neck. China is an energy addict. They import massive amounts of oil and gas to keep their dark factories running and their lights on. Roughly 80% of this energy must pass through the Strait of Malacca, a tiny narrow choke point near Singapore. And guess who sits at the western mouth of that strait? The Andaman and Nicobar Islands, India's unsinkable aircraft carriers. If China dares to launch a full scale attack in the Himalayas, India doesn't need to fight tank on tank battles in Tibet. They simply need to park a few destroyers in the Malacca Strait and turn off the tap. No oil, no gas, no economy. China knows this. It keeps them awake at night. They have tried to build pipelines through Pakistan, CPA, to bypass this, but those pipelines run through insurgent territory and are nowhere near finished or capable of replacing the volume they need. The geography of the Indian Ocean turns India into the gatekeeper of China's survival. While China is busy building carrier killer missiles to scare the Americans, they have no answer for a simple naval blockade that starves their economy into submission in weeks. The geography forces China to fight uphill, literally and metaphorically, every single step of the way. So, when we look at the geography, we see a theater of war that is designed by nature to kill the invader. The lack of oxygen neutralizes their technology. The rugged terrain neutralizes their tanks. The night map population distribution exposes their lack of strategic depth, and the ocean geography hands the kill switch to the Indian Navy. The Chinese soldier, gasping in his oxygen tent, dreaming of his video games in Shanghai, is not a conqueror. He is a victim of a regime that ignored the map. He is standing on the roof of the world, picking a fight with the landlord, and the landlord has spent 5,000 years learning how to breathe where others choke. China is nothing but a glorified North Korea with a Gucci belt. To the outside world, they project an image of a monolithic, unstoppable juggernaut, but if you peel back the red paint, you find the same structural rot, the same paranoia, and the same terrifying fragility that defines the Hermit Kingdom, just on a larger scale. The People's Liberation Army (PLA) is a parade army designed to look terrifying on television to scare its own citizens and impress third world dictators. But it is fundamentally a Potemkin village military. You see the goose stepping soldiers, the perfectly choreographed missile launches, and the slick propaganda videos where they blow up imaginary American aircraft carriers, and it looks impressive, but war is not a movie. War is chaos, war is messy, and war requires the one thing that a totalitarian state destroys in its people: the ability to think for themselves. In the Indian Army, a junior commissioned officer, JCO, or even a Havildar is trained to take initiative. If his lieutenant gets shot, he takes command, changes the plan, and keeps fighting because he comes from a culture of democracy, debate, and jugaad improvisation. In the PLA, the command structure is rigid, top down, and paralyzed by fear, a direct clone of the North Korean model where a soldier does not dare to sneeze without permission from a political commissar. If a Chinese commander is killed or the communications are jammed by Indian electronic warfare, which they will be, the unit freezes because the little emperor in the trench has been trained since kindergarten to never question authority, to never improvise, and to wait for orders that are never coming. This is the wolf warrior trap. They act tough and aggressive when they have the script, but the moment the script burns, they have no idea how to ad lib, whereas the Indian soldier thrives in the chaos because his entire life in a vibrant, noisy, chaotic democracy has been a training ground for resilience. A factor that is often overlooked in traditional military analysis but is critical when discussing high altitude warfare. The recent pandemic, which originated within China's own borders, didn't just damage the world's economy, it left a lasting physiological mark on the Chinese population itself. We know that the virus had a particular affinity for attacking the respiratory system, leaving millions of survivors with reduced lung capacity and long term pulmonary fibrosis. And even if the Aladdin data hides the true extent of the damage, biology does not lie. Now, take a generation of young men who grew up in some of the most polluted cities on earth, where the air quality in Beijing is often equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day, add the long term scarring from the pandemic, and then drop them onto a battlefield at 16,000 feet where the air is thin and unforgiving. It is a recipe for a mass casualty event without a single Indian bullet being fired. You are essentially sending an army of respiratory invalids to fight a wrestling match in a vacuum chamber against people, the Indians who have lungs made of leather and have been breathing clean mountain air for generations, turning the Himalayas into a graveyard for lungs that were already compromised before they even put on a uniform. But the final nail in the coffin, the reason why China will never ever dare to turn a border skirmish into a full scale war, is the bigger fish waiting in the Pacific, the United States of America. China knows that India is a massive headache, a tiger that can bite its leg off, but the USA is the Grim Reaper. Beijing is terrified of the two front war scenario, which is the classic blunder that has destroyed empires throughout history, from Napoleon to Hitler. If China commits its best troops, its best jets, and its logistical reserves to a meat grinder in the Himalayas to fight India, they leave their entire eastern flank, the coast where all the money, people, and industry are, completely exposed. The United States Navy is the mightiest force to ever grace the face of the earth, a force of nature that operates 11 carrier strike groups, each one more powerful than the entire air force of most nations. China knows that the moment they get bogged down fighting the Gurkhas in Ladakh, the US Pacific Fleet, along with allies like Japan and Australia, will tighten the noose in the South China Sea. The Quad Alliance, USA, India, Japan, Australia, is not just a diplomatic club, it is a strategic cage designed to encircle the dragon. This paralysis is evident in their behavior. They scream, they threaten, they release animated videos of bombing Guam, but they do not act because they know that their military is unproven, their economy is fragile, and their geography is a prison. We have dissected the dying demographics and the economic house of cards, but now we arrive at the glorified North Korea reality of Chinese technology, specifically the fatal flaw in their military industrial complex, the sticky fingers problem. For decades, Beijing's research and development strategy was essentially Control C, Control V. They bought Russian Su-27s, reverse engineered them into the JA-11, and then stopped paying Russia. They hacked the F-35 plans to build the J-20. They copied the Humvee. But there is a fundamental catastrophic error in that strategy that the technocrats in Beijing missed. When you get caught stealing from the shop enough times, the shopkeeper bans you for life. China is now the geopolitical equivalent of a shoplifter who is banned from every high end tech store in the mall. The West has finally woken up to the reality that selling dual use technology to a totalitarian regime is a bad idea. This technological blockade is why Chinese jet engines like the WS-10 and WS-15 are still struggling to match the reliability of Western or even Russian equivalents. You can copy the shape of a stealth fighter or a turbine blade, but you cannot copy the metallurgical intuition, the decades of painful trial and error required to make a single crystal alloy that doesn't melt at 2000 degrees Celsius. Western engines run for 6,000 hours. Chinese engines are lucky to hit 1500 before they need a total overhaul or simply explode. They are stuck in a copy paste warfare mindset, forcing them to rely on mass production of inferior clones, but as established in the demographic analysis, they don't have the manpower for mass mobilization anymore either. This brings us to the profound difference in the trust economy between India and China. There is often a naive clamor from internet commentators asking why India, after buying the Rafale, doesn't just reverse engineer the Meteor missile, the deadliest air to air missile in the world, and make its own cheap copies. This line of thinking reveals a total misunderstanding of modern warfare. If India were to violate the contract, crack open the Meteor, and try to copy it, France would instantly cut off the supply chain. Modern weapons run on software and source codes. Without the original manufacturer support, you don't have the source code for the Rafale's radar integration, you don't have the replacement parts, and you don't have the updates. India would be left with a multi-billion-dollar fleet of useless paperweights. India understands that trust is a strategic asset. Because India honors contracts and protects intellectual property, the Western world is opening the classified candy store. The United States is offering the F-21, the F-15EX, and has even put the F-35 on the table for discussion, a level of trust they don't even grant to some NATO allies. India operates the C-17 Globemaster, the P-8 Poseidon, and the AH-64 Apache, the absolute crown jewels of American aerospace. The West knows that if they sell to India, the tech stays in India and is used by a professional democracy. If they sell to China, the tech ends up in a knockoff factory in Chengdu the next week. This is why India fights with the best of the West, Rafales, M777s, integrated with its own indigenous breakthroughs, BrahMos, while China fights with photocopies of 1990s tech that have been cut off from the global supply chain. Now let's get one thing straight because people get this twisted. There is a massive difference between stealing tech you bought with a handshake and ripping apart a missile that was fired at your face. You can't apply the same logic to India reverse engineering the shit out of stuff delivered during a war. Look at the Emram 120. The Americans sold those bad boys to Pakistan. If Pakistan decides to fire that American missile at an Indian jet and it lands in Indian territory, guess what? That tech belongs to India now. That's not theft, that's the spoils of war. It's on the Americans. They sold the gun to the enemy, they can't bitch and moan about intellectual property when that property was used to try and kill Indian pilots. You sold it to the guy shooting at me, that's your problem. If it lands in my backyard, I'm tearing it down to the last damn screw to see what makes it tick, and I'm going to use that knowledge to build something that kills it. That is fair game. That is the law of the jungle. China, on the other hand, buys a jet from a friend, Russia, and then stabs them in the back by cloning it during peacetime. India honors the contract when you treat them with respect, but if you arm their enemies, don't be surprised when your secret tech gets dissected on a lab table in Bangalore. This isolation leads to the he said she said myth of Chinese military power. China's entire reputation is built on brochureware, slick videos, and bold claims that have never been tested. Our J-20 is invisible, claims the PLA. Prove it, says the world. No, says the PLA. China has not fought a real prolonged war since Vietnam in 1979, where they received a bloody nose from a much smaller neighbor. Their entire tech stack is untested. The world assumes their missiles work because the brochure says so. The world assumes their stealth works because the video looks cool. Meanwhile, India is battle hardening its military with a hybrid model. India tests its gear in the freezing, oxygen starved glaciers of Siachen and the baking deserts of Rajasthan. We know Indian gear works because it is constantly being used in the most hostile environments on earth. Trusting China to tell the truth about the radar cross section of its jets when they can't even tell the truth about the number of people living in their own cities is a gamble that no sane military planner would take. The autopsy is complete and the verdict is absolute. China is a paper tiger that is rapidly soaking in the rain. They are fighting a war against the laws of nature, and nature is winning. They have run out of children to fill their ranks, creating an army of only sons who are the sole lifelines for their aging families. They have built an economy of dark factories filled with robots that cannot consume, destroying their own internal market. They have alienated the world that used to buy their goods, leading to a massive industrial exodus. And they are geographically trapped by mountains they cannot breathe in and oceans they cannot control. The little emperor standing at the border in Ladakh is not a warrior. He is a tragic figure. He is a lonely son of a dying lineage, gasping for air in a luxury oxygen tent that proves his biological weakness, holding a rifle that is a copy of a copy, terrified of the mountain hardened Indian soldier across the valley. He knows that his government treats him as nothing more than a statistic to be fudged to appease a dictator. China will never win a war against India because to fight India is to fight biology, geography, and demographics all at once. They will continue to posture to release aggressive wolf warrior movies and to inflate their Aladdin statistics, but they will never dare to cross the line where the propaganda stops and the real shooting starts. They know that on that day the illusion will shatter and the dragon will be revealed for what it truly is old, short of breath, untrusted, and utterly alone.